Well, my name's Sarah Whiteley, and I research in a discipline called cognitive poetics. So I'm really interested in the mental processes that happen when people read, and also the kinds of meanings that particular literary texts have for people. So I'm interested in studying particular texts and also theorising about reading more generally. Creative writing in the community project then was run by a team of 5 staff in the Department of English at the University of Sheffield. And the general idea of the project was to examine how the university links with the local community through creative writing. And the idea was also to foster and develop those links through some new initiatives and projects and events. So as part of creative writing in the community, we organised festivals, poetry readings, workshops for local schools, school children and school teachers. And then my strand of the project was all about examining how different readers in Sheffield engage with creative writing, engage with the same pieces of creative writing. But cognitive poetics is interested in reading and interested in explaining how people read by using theories from psychology and from linguistics. And usually people who work in cognitive poetics tend to study their own responses to text. So they read a text themselves and think, oh, what effect did it have on me? And then try and explain it using these theories. A big issue in cognitive poetic research is the extent to which sort of academic reading is similar to the way that people in other contexts and in the wider world engage with particular texts. And so the project, my strand of the project was really trying to collect some information about the way different readers read the same poems, so I could reflect on these issues. So I tried to recruit as many different types of readers as I could in Sheffield, and I wanted to collect data from readers both within the university and outside of the university as well. So I managed to collect data from 7 different groups of readers. I had one group of academic researchers who usually meet to talk about academic papers, but they agreed to talk about poems for me. I had 4 local reading groups who meet in each other's living rooms to talk about literature regularly, and they agreed to read the poems I wanted them to for those particular meetings. And I also had 2 groups of students, first year undergraduate students who were studying English, who agreed to come and talk about the poems with each other at university. I gave each group 3 poems from Simon Armitage's latest collection. I gave them An Accommodation, I'll Be There to Love and Comfort You, and Upon Opening the Chest Freezer. And I chose to use Simon's poetry because I wanted to use a contemporary author, and I wanted somebody who was critically renowned but also popular. And I chose those 3 poems in particular because I found them quite interesting. I think they sort of show a movement in Simon's poetry from they're about everyday topics, but they move into the surreal as well. And I was interested to see how readers responded to those surreal elements of the poems. So I gave each of the 7 groups copies of the 3 poems, and also I supplied them with a voice recorder. And I just left them to talk about the poems. I was interested in anything that they had to say about the text, so I didn't want to give them any particular topics to talk about. And I ended up collecting around 10 hours of data in total from the 7 groups. The first thing to do was obviously to transcribe the data. So I was just transcribing it for content, so trying to get down the kinds of things that people were saying. And then I was interested in asking certain questions of it. And this was an exploratory study, so I wasn't trying to test a particular hypothesis, or I wasn't trying to find something particular. I was interested in what the readers said generally. And the kinds of questions I was asking of the data was, how do the readers interpret the poems? So what do the poems mean to these readers? And are there similarities or differences between the meanings that the different groups associate with the poems? I was also interested in how the different groups talk about the poems. So what do they do when they're talking about poetry? How much time do they spend talking about the author, the characters, themselves, and really sort of what interests them about the poems. And I was also interested, comparing across the groups, to ask questions like, do different levels of literary training affect how we read poetry or what we do with poetry when we're talking about it? So for instance, do academics seem to do something different to students and local reading groups when they're talking about the same texts? So something that I found really striking when I was comparing the different discussions was that each group seemed to be agreeing, there seemed to be some general consensus over the different meanings that the text could have. And I found that really surprising, because I thought that the surreal elements of the text might mean that there were some really disparate responses, but actually there were great similarities between the types of interpretations that the groups were coming up with, which I found really interesting. And then the main differences I found between the groups, which is another thing that I'm thinking about still at the moment, but it seemed like the student groups and the reading groups were much more concerned with evaluating the poems and talking about the author as well. So they'd say things about the author's compositional processes. For instance, they'd talk about particular lines and think, what was he thinking when he wrote that? Why did he put that there? And they'd also talk about their opinions about the language used or about the ideas expressed, and about the success of the poems. And I found that really interesting, because in the academic reading group, this kind of evaluative discourse wasn't really present. I think that's got some really interesting implications for people, academics who are studying reading, because I think it shows that we need to think a lot more about the relationship not just between the reader and the text, but also the reader and the author and the text, and that's something that we shy away from at the moment. But I think that in order to be able to engage more with the way that people read outside of universities, that's an important issue that we should be thinking about. Especially in stylistics and cognitive poetics, where we're very focused on the language of the text and the mental processes of the reader, but we kind of don't think so much about the way that readers are aware of the author, and they're aware that somebody's crafted a particular text, and their opinions about that crafting process actually influence their interpretation of it as well. It's to do with the different contexts, because obviously reading groups maybe more so, maybe less so than academic reading groups. They're not just getting together to talk about their interpretation of the poem. They're getting together to talk with each other and sort of have a group discourse. And so I think for reading groups and for the students as well, it seemed like agreeing on a group interpretation or a group evaluation of the poem was more important, and it probably serves sort of social functions, and it's just a different purpose of the group. Whereas with the academics, they weren't trying to agree on a group evaluation of the poem. In fact, they were more interested in the differences between each other's opinions rather than the similarities, and so maybe that's got something to do with it. The reason I'm doing it is because there's lots of theories about reading, and academics are very interested in theorising about reading, but they don't often look at the way that people outside of universities read. And so I think that's what my study, it's the first study of its kind to collect as much discussion data about the same texts. And so I think it was exploratory, and from that I think it shows that we need to be collecting more data and engaging with readers outside of university.